Today I'd like to talk about the reasoning behind me purchasing this spring drive tuna can. Now, if you've seen some of my older videos, you would know that I've had this SBDX009 tuna can for a very long time. And I guess you could call it a second generation of tuna cans compared to the very first 6159 tuna can. And I've had it for quite a while, and eventually the sort of all black aesthetic was sort of a bit boring, and I started thinking about getting a 6159 tuna can. Well, after I started researching and I figured out what the price points are and everything, I had one other important goal, and that was to look into the availability of spare parts and repairability of a 6159 tuna can. The thing is, as I've learned before, when you get into vintage watches, there's a lot of really cool things about them. They were designed differently than modern watches. They have usually a history behind it, especially for things like actual dive watches that were actually used for diving. And that's all well and good, but the thing is, if you can't get parts for it, and you can't get anyone to service them, then it's nothing but a paperweight. And that's really what my biggest fear was, because I may have mentioned in another video with my Aquastar Benthos, I spent over a year stalking eBay trying to find a replacement dial that wasn't even in great shape. So it was a really important point. And the reality was that with the, as far as the 6159 goes, parts are really hard to come by, and when you do find them, they're very, very expensive. And throw in the fact that it's a very high beat movement at 36,000 bph, which basically means that parts will wear quicker than on a lower beat movement. Sooner or later, you're going to run into a situation where it's going to be very difficult to repair through replacement parts. And I fear that eventually it could become a paperweight, and that's definitely not something that I'm interested in. So with that perspective, I decided instead of moving backwards in time, I would move forwards in time, and that's where this one comes in. Now, to get the elephant in the room, of course, is the handset. Now, Seiko changed handsets where before we had the very iconic and traditional tuna can handset, and not that long ago now they started this new Arrow handset. Now, I was never the biggest fan of it, but with time I guess my opinion of it softened a bit, and it became, I guess, tolerable to me. Now, in an ideal world, would I have preferred something with original tuna can hands on this? Yeah, but that's not available, so this is one of those things where you either take it or leave it. So with the handset out of the way, the big difference is, I mean, obviously they both are traditional tuna cans aesthetically, but they have enough differences. For instance, the lugs on this one are built into the shroud, and because of that, it sits much flatter on the wrist. And if you look here, let's compare this one. Once we get that in focus, you'll see that the strap can sit a lot flatter on the spring drive tuna than the automatic tuna, and that makes it much more wearable in my experience. And speaking of lugs, the strap that comes with the automatic tuna, I mean, this one has wear, but it's a silicone strap that is easily the best strap I've ever used. It's pliable, it's very, very, very comfortable, but at the same time, it keeps the watch securely centered on your wrist, which isn't, in my experience anyway, something that usually happens with the older urethane bands. And I liked it so much that I got the same model for my other tuna cans. Now, it's not cheap, and usually it's probably better to try to find a watch that's being sold used with it, like in my experience, but I would still recommend it even at the very high price point it is, because it really makes wearing these, well, giant watches a lot more pleasant. And again, you'll see it has these friction gripping marks, and this one is, whoops, S22 Japan. Apparently they have all sorts of levels of these straps. There are lower end silicone straps that they make, and I think they'll be labeled China, but this high-end one I can absolutely vouch for. It's super, super comfortable for heavyish large watches. Moving on, the lume on this is a bit green. It's rather striking when you get a lot of light in, and it just becomes green, which isn't quite the way on the SBDX. And since these are modern Luminova materials, that it's unlikely that that's going to change. But this one is strikingly green when it's glowing. The bezel is very shiny, which contrasts greatly from other tuna cans, which usually are fairly matte, and it does give it more of a sort of fancy luxury feel, which doesn't bother me. Obviously, it'll show scratches more readily, but you can't have everything. And being a spring drive, it has a power meter, but that's never bothered me, and I even sort of like the red markings on it. The one main criticism I have is the crown. It could be a little bigger, because when it's recessed in the shroud, it's not the easiest to grip. And if you compare it, to the automatic, you can see that it's much more tapered, and it's not nearly as grippy as the traditional large-sized crowns. Now, it's not the end of the world or anything, but it's just a little bit more fiddly when it comes to pulling it out and setting the time. But at the end of the day, you don't really do that too often. But overall, I really, really do like it. And of course, I have to get to the most important point. Since I traveled into the future instead of the past, the big thing with this is, if this breaks, you can send it to Seiko Japan, and it can be serviced, and you can get parts for it, which you can't do with the 6159. And after getting burned a few times with certain vintage watches, I've really come to appreciate the importance of that. Now, I don't usually like using the factory, but when you have the spring drive and everything, it does complicate things a bit, since I'm just about sure no one else will service this. So that really was my thinking as to how I ended up making this purchase, and perhaps this could be useful to someone or not. But anyway, thanks for watching.